Audiobook and Sapience Institute present Nihilism and Islam, My Poison and My Cure. Written by Yusuf Ponders. Narrated by David Williamson. Part 3. Overcoming Obstacles. What obstacles? The task of what follows now is to put Islam forward as an antidote to the nihilistic issues faced by modern society. I do intend to do this with respect to both the causes and effects of nihilism. However, before I can do this effectively, I will need to offer responses to some common objections that act as a barrier to people taking Islam as a serious option. This is often because of misconceptions picked up by popular atheist apologetics. Just as someone who is against vaccines may prevent themselves from obtaining a legitimate cure to their ailments, I will attempt to show how these common objections act in a very similar manner. The arguments I discuss herein are often put forward by detractors of Islam and other religions, yet they fail to offer any valid reasons to avoid studying and to continue dismissing it. God willing, I hope that in tackling these issues first, I may be able to carve a clear path through the confusing overgrowth that exists in today's anti-religious polemics. So, without further ado, let us jump straight into it. Why believe in the divine? Why should we believe in the divine? Is it not more natural to take an atheistic position? The short answer is no, not at all. Belief in the supernatural comes very naturally to the human being. An article written by Paul Bloom, a self-declared atheist, titled "Religion is Natural," makes the case that recent findings suggest that two foundational aspects of religious belief in mind-body dualism, the existence of a soul, and belief in divine agents, come naturally to young children. And this is the case even if the parents that raise them do not share this belief. God says in the Quran, "And remember when your Lord brought forth from the loins of the children of Adam their descendants, and had them testify regarding themselves. Allah asked, 'Am I not your Lord?' They replied, 'Yes, you are. We testify.' He cautioned, 'Now you have no right to say on the Day of Judgment, we were not aware of this.' All of this adds credence to the Islamic idea of the fitrah, which is the notion that belief in God and the supernatural is innately ingrained into our very being. Richard Dawkins even concedes that historically, there has never been an atheist civilization. When asked on Joe Rogan's podcast, has there ever been a civilization that existed without a belief in a higher power? His response was, "I don't think there has, no." The divine has always been a constant feature throughout human history, and continues to be so today. Furthermore, Jamie Turner has put forward a convincing case defending the proposition that theistic belief can be properly basic. That is to say that belief in God can be rational, without argumentation. In fact, he has also argued that this can be specifically applied to full-fledged Islamic belief as well. As Allah says in the Quran, "So be steadfast in faith and all uprightness, O Prophet, the natural way of Allah, which He has instilled in all people. Let there be no change in this creation of Allah. That is the straight way, but most people do not know." God has placed in each human being the ability to recognize His existence. God is not an elitist, and has not made it necessary for every human being to have to jump through endless complex philosophical hoops to come to the realization of His existence. Recognition of this fact should be just as accessible to the farmer as it is to the academic. Allah says, "We have sent you, O Prophet, only as a mercy for the whole world." Not just a few clever people with the time and ability to tackle countless abstract ideas and arguments. To suggest otherwise is unreasonable. No empirical evidence? Another common tactic is the demand for direct empirical evidence of God's existence. I would like to give you a very simple example, which should be sufficient to show the absurdity of such a request. Consider this. One day I make a computer game with self-aware artificial intelligence contained within it. They have an ingrained belief programmed into them, which makes belief in a higher power completely natural. However, one day, one of them begins to doubt and demands evidence for the creator. He insists that he limits what will be accepted as evidence to material things contained within the computer game. Can you see why this might be absurd? He's essentially demanding you show him the game developer inside of the game. This is like demanding to see evidence of the painter, but limiting the evidence to the painting itself. Such unreasonable demands can never be fulfilled, and the inability to meet this demand is not sufficient for them to claim justification in their denial of that which comes innately to all societies, nor of that which is inferred by the existence of all things. It is important to establish what should be considered evidence. Sometimes when in dialogue, with atheists/agnostics in particular, you may come across someone who demands direct empirical evidence exclusively, and completely neglect all the other types of evidence available that could be completely relevant to many different contexts. Here are a few examples. 1. Rational evidence. This refers to arguments and logical reasoning, which can be used to support claims where empirical evidence is difficult or impossible to obtain. This could involve using deductive reasoning to try and make inferences to conclusions from a string of true premises, inductive reasoning to try and make generalizations from sets of data, or abductive reasoning, which involves coming up with hypotheses or explanations which are based on incomplete/uncertain information, and you try to fill in the gaps. Other than this, you have analogical reasoning, causal reasoning, and counterfactual reasoning, just to name a few. 2. Testimonial evidence. This can include things like the statements of reliable and trustworthy witnesses, and expert testimony from those trained in or familiar with certain fields. All of these can and do offer great insight in many circumstances, and is even heavily used within the scientific community. Every scientist does not take it upon themselves to replicate every single scientific experiment, to consider themselves capable of referencing it or utilizing it in their own work or thinking. When reading a scientific paper, you are taking the testimony of those who have claimed to do the experimentation, so that you don't have to. All of this can give you great insight and perspective that you may not have achieved from direct empirical evidence, especially considering you may not actually have the expertise to be able to understand or interpret that evidence even if it was presented to you. 3. Circumstantial evidence. This can be a kind of evidence that may not necessarily be a direct and indisputable proof of a particular claim, but it can be something which can be brought forward as supporting the increased likelihood of one claim over other competing claims. Let me give you an example. If you find someone's DNA at a crime scene, you can use this circumstantial evidence to build a case against them as a potential suspect. It would certainly give you good reason to suspect them over others whose DNA was not present, and can be used as evidence despite not being bulletproof. As yes, it may increase the weight of one claim over another, but it doesn't guarantee that claim's truth. Nonetheless, the fact that it is not an absolute proof is not enough to dismiss its utility. 4. Anecdotal evidence. This has a bit of overlap with testimonial evidence, and includes stories and experiences given by individuals, which has the potential to offer valuable insight into certain issues or phenomenon. This one is one that can be criticized for being unreliable, but nonetheless it can be useful when it comes to trying to understand subjective experiences of people and the ways that they can be impacted by these events. 5. statistical evidence. This is the analysis of data and information to find insight into trends, patterns, or relationships between things that could potentially be missed or not be completely obvious from the start when relying on things like direct observations alone. Understanding that there are many different types of evidence, and that most of these can and are used in a variety of different contexts, is incredibly important. They are crucial not just when we are talking specifically about things like religion, but also when it comes to many other fields outside of this too. For example, the scientific community can and does understand the limits, and sometimes the strengths offered by varying types of evidence. It is important when it comes to constructing or designing the way experiments may be conducted, or when analyzing the data or drawing conclusions from the information that has been gathered. Outside of science, such evidence is used in politics or in courts of law. It is very important that we recognize and make the effort to utilize the different types of evidence which are available when it is suitable to do so according to the context. Let us not be those who completely neglect to consider the nuances of this subject matter and stop asking for evidence of the baker inside of the bread. Too many gods and religions. A common objection to the theistic position is merely to point to the sheer number of gods and religions in existence around the world today and throughout history. This is important, as it is connected to one of the major contributing factors that give rise to the experience of nihilism, as I outlined earlier. That is, nihilism being brought on as the result of being overwhelmed by large amounts of information. In short, I explained how this generates hopelessness, which in turn leads to a belief that the task at hand is one which is impossible to conquer. Life is short, and the mountain of information you must consume is too large. What follows from this is the loss of any motivation to tackle the issues at hand. It is to fall into apathetic agnosticism, and ceasing to care about what the answers to many of the big questions are. But this path to the rejection of religion wholesale is not justifiable. It fails to ask if there are any methods which we can use to help us sort through large amounts of information in an effective way. For example, let us say that someone has been murdered, and Sherlock Holmes deduces the possibility of it being one of 3 suspects, based on the available evidence. Would I be justified in barging into the investigation and exclaiming, "Oh my! How are we ever going to find the murderer? Never mind these 3 people, or whether there is good reason to take them as potential suspects. There are 8 billion people on the planet, and it could have been any one of them. We cannot make a conclusion until we have assessed every single person individually. But as this is an impossible task, we should not bother to investigate at all." Would anyone really be justified in using this to stop the investigation? Of course not. Furthermore, it would be even more absurd to go a step further and deny the existence of a murderer altogether, simply because the quantity of potential candidates and information is so large. It should not be falsely assumed that we would have to explore every conceivable possibility to come to a justified conclusion. That is, convict someone of a crime. When I began my journey into religious discourse, I found myself often overwhelmed by the sheer number of different religions and all the different approaches to religious discourse. I used the fact that I was overwhelmed by the number of possibilities as a quasi-refutation to all religions. I would echo the words of the likes of Richard Dawkins and his ilk, who perpetrate such thinking. They do this every time they point to the large number of religions as one of many reasons that lead to the rejection of religion altogether. Just as in the absurd example of someone who might reject the existence of a murderer, despite the clear signs available to the contrary, I truly believe people reject the Creator along the same lines. Dawkins repeats this cliché often enough that he seems to believe that the argument has some merit. Enough so for it to be his opening statement on his feature of his Big Think discussion on faith. But is it really a good objection? We must first ask ourselves, are there any good methods available to help us sift through this very large pile of information? And if there was, would this make this very objection a moot point? Do we really need to research every religion in full to justifiably be able to pick one of them? Let us return for a moment to the example of the murderer. One way we can overcome this trivial issue is to ask certain questions which will reduce the number of suspects by placing them into categories that can then be written off, and anything that falls into that category can be disregarded. For example, if the murder took place in Scotland, from this one piece of information alone, we do not even need to consider anyone who has never been to Scotland. You can further reduce the number of suspects by asking more questions, and through a process of elimination, be left with a much more manageable figure that is not nearly as daunting as the first. Furthermore, if you have evidence or reasons that give you good justification for taking something seriously, then you might not even need to go through the process of elimination. For example, if you had a confession from someone who had the murder weapon, had motive, had the ability, and fits the crime perfectly, then you can close the case and cease investigations. The same can be done with religion. We can place them into categories and ask questions about the fundamentals of these categories. We can deliberate between them about which is more likely to be true, and which is the most rationally coherent option. Apostates from many religions often complain about being told you need to have something equivalent to a PhD in a religion to leave it, but need no good reason at all to join the fold. However, I would argue that just as you do not necessarily need a PhD to leave a religion, neither do you need one to join. And by greater reason, you certainly do not need one in every religion out there to decide. This is not to say that you do not need valid reasons to join a religion. I stand firmly in the belief that if you affirm something for the wrong reasons, even if it happens to be true, that it can potentially be detrimental to that person when it comes to maintaining that belief. Later down the line, they may discover issues with the reasons that motivated accepting a proposition, and this could stimulate abandoning the belief altogether. I have witnessed this many times, and had to speak to people who have made this mistake. This would clearly be a tremendous loss if the abandoned belief was true. So, for this reason, I advise everyone to think carefully and sincerely about these things. What questions could be asked, then? You could begin with the most fundamental question. Is there a God? If, in your exploration of the subject, you conclude that the answer to this question is yes or no, then you can disregard everything that falls under the incorrect answer. This is exactly what atheists do when they disregard all religions, as they conclude the answer to the question is no. But let us for a moment assume that the arguments atheists have against the notion of a God ultimately fail upon further analysis. Does that mean that you cannot continue to use this method? Of course not. It simply means the process of questioning continues. If throughout this exploration we become convinced of a creative agent, we can continue to ask about its nature. Is it more likely to have a will, or be equivalent to a mindless machine churning out multiple universes? Is it better to refer to this creative force as a singular being, or as a multiplicity? Upon going down this line of questioning, you can effectively write off large numbers of religions. If it can be shown through this exploration, for example, that pure monotheism is the most coherent option, then what need is there to continue looking into the countless polytheistic pantheons that do and have existed historically? If it can also be shown that these polytheistic positions presuppose a unique, singular creative force that then gives rise to any multiplicity, then we can just focus specifically on monotheistic religions. Asking these very fundamental questions is an incredibly effective method of sorting through the available information, and simply pointing out the sheer number of religions is not a valid rebuttal, as it can easily be overcome. Let us now posit a skeptic that is not completely satisfied, but they are willing to concede, for the sake of argument, to the monotheistic position being more rational than a polytheistic one. However, they still insist on asking, which one God is the right one? Is it the God of the Jews, the God of the Christians, the God of the Muslims? The assumption here is that because each monotheistic party described their God in different ways, that this necessarily means that each claim must refer to some unique entity, rather than simply being a mixture of true and false descriptions of the same one God. I will give the example of a man. Let us call him Dave. He has connections with 3 different people. Each connection was established at a different time, and these 3 acquaintances meet up and describe Dave differently. The first says that Dave is X, and the second says that Dave is not X. The third says Dave is Y, and the first denies it, and says Dave is not Y. However, despite all their disagreements, there is a lot of overlap on things they do agree on. For example, each of the 3 people understand Dave to be a builder, and to have been responsible for building a particular house. They all consider him to be a good and competent builder responsible for its creation, and admit that this house belongs to him. A 4th person then joins the conversation. He listens to them talk and notices that each of them has a different way of referring to the mutual friend. One calls him Dave, another David, and the last, Davy. He then notices the disagreement about the description of certain attributes held by the mutual friend. He hears someone say that Dave loves everyone he ever meets, regardless of what kind of person they are. He hears the next disagree and say that it is not true. He knows Dave does not love evil people, but despite this, he is the most loving person he has ever come across, and is always open to forgiving those who seek forgiveness. He then hears another debate about whether Dave is capable of being a married bachelor or not. The debate continues, and as a result, the 4th member claims they must all be talking about a different person. He asks, which Dave is the right Dave? And due to the existence of these differences, insists he lacks belief in all 3 Daves, because of the incorrect inference that each description is of a different person. As Allah says in the Quran, "We believe in what has been revealed to us, and what was revealed to you. Our God and your God is only one, and to him we fully submit." The fact that others describe him incorrectly, or associate things with him incorrectly, does not make their God a different God, in the same way as the example above shows that people making false descriptions about someone is not enough to say they are talking about different people. It can simply mean that one or more of the people that are describing said person have made a mistake in their evaluation. To conclude this section, it is not enough to point to the large number of religions or gods, or even to the differing descriptions of what is referred to as the one God, to refute the idea of religion or of God. It is characteristic of impatience and laziness, more than it is of intellectual rigor. There are valid methods that can and should be utilized to overcome the objections given. These methods are used by many people to deduce which religion is the right religion and what understanding of God is best. On the wisdom of old. It is not unreasonable to suggest that tradition can sometimes be a bad thing. Allah makes this clear in the Quran, when He chastises people for holding on to something simply because they found their fathers following it. Abraham is shown to be someone who breaks away from the ways of his people and suffers the consequences of that decision. They are so displeased with his unwillingness to follow what his forefathers were upon that they attempt to burn him in a fire. Islam opens itself up to the necessity of critiquing certain traditions because of their content, and rejects them on this basis. However, this is not a rejection of tradition wholesale. Tradition in this framework is not seen as bad by virtue of the fact that it is a tradition, but rather because of that which it wishes to instill in its people: the worship of anything other than the one true God. Now, beyond the notion of associating partners with Allah and committing what is referred to as shirk in the Islamic paradigm, tradition can be seen as something that is possibly useful for a people, and not something to be taken away if it cannot be replaced with something better. In Islamic lands, there were a class of people known as dhimmis, or protected people. These people, as the name suggests, were given protection under Islamic rule. They were allowed to practice their traditions and to live within their communities unharmed. The value of having a tradition rather than nothing at all, and an understanding of the importance of this to a people, is inferred within the rulings of Islamic law. There can be genuinely productive practices separated from the acts of worship to other than God that can develop and become embedded as part of a culture. These practices can be derived through a process of trial and error, and you may see the benefits of them either immediately or in the long run. Some of the benefits of such practices can be so subtle that many may not be able to see them at all. Take preventative measures as an example. If there is a particular kind of behavior that gives rise to problematic consequences on a societal level, if not kept in check, and these problems only slowly manifested after several generations, then it is conceivable that preventative measures that are put in place could stop the possibility of these problems from manifesting. However, it would also prevent the populace from seeing or experiencing the consequences of removing such restrictions, and therefore they would not see or experience the benefits of it either. In this way, they become blind to its benefits, because its presence is something they were born into and raised within. I have a great example of this with the blessings we have bestowed upon us today, and I will use this to draw an analogy with the restrictive nature of tradition. There was a time when our ancestors did not have access to washing machines. There are still people in certain parts of the world that do not have such luxuries today. Instead, they must clean their clothes by hand, sometimes having to travel down to the local river to do so. The methods they apply in the absence of these luxuries require a lot of effort and energy. This is effort and energy we no longer need to worry about, because technological advancements have removed these problems from our lives. However, it is seldom you hear about someone who gazes upon their washing machine with awe, or any common household device for that matter. These things have become peripheral. Like the air that we breathe, we barely take notice of it until its existence, or lack thereof, becomes a problem. For example, when it malfunctions and ceases to do what it is supposed to do. At this point, it can become a burden and a source of stress. Once it is fixed, very quickly falls back into the peripheral of our daily experiences. It is a tool. We throw our washing in, we hit some buttons, and we go about our daily lives. The same could be said about many things we have in our households: refrigerators, flushing toilets, running clean water, central heating, the internet, etc. All these things are luxuries, especially when you take a perspective which includes the standards of living throughout all of history. We have plenty of reasons to be infinitely grateful for our current situations. We live even better than kings did just a century ago. If you take someone who has lived without knowledge of the existence of such luxuries and give it to them, it is likely that the awe and appreciation that they experience would arrive almost immediately. However, contrast that with the likes of the modern individual, born and raised with such things around them for generations. It can hardly be said to register as an experience, or as something significant at all. Its very existence and the fact that it is functioning well are things which are expected. Unless it becomes a problem, at which point such blessings become annoying, and fixing it only gives us relief. Now, to draw this back to the idea of the restrictive nature of tradition, the negative effects that certain restrictions keep at bay will not be noticed by virtue of the fact that they are kept at bay. If you do not experience a problem, you have no necessary trigger to make you aware of its existence. In the same way that I said the existence of the washing machine becomes peripheral, and that the problems in life that are caused by the removal of the tool are hidden due to it working as it should, this can also occur to the tradition. The benefits of the restriction can become peripheral and cease to be noticed by those who benefit from them. They become nothing more than the whirring of a washing machine in the background of a noisy home. For example, let us say there is a hypothetical society that does not allow the widespread drinking of alcohol, and the people that make up this society are not aware of the long-term negative effects that take hold of the society who allow such things to occur. To transition from treating such things as taboo to then allowing them to occur out of ignorance of its consequences is going to expose this society to a lot of problems that they could have otherwise avoided. In the UK, for example, alcohol is implicated in an enormous amount of crime and disorder, and the effects on victims can be devastating. It is a factor of around 39% of all violent crimes in England, and 49% in Wales, as well as contributing to public disorder and antisocial behavior in communities across the country. Keeping alcohol out of a society is one way of preventing the consequences caused by it, which include the unnecessary strain mentioned above, but also much more. It is said that the direct costs of alcohol use to the government amount to around £3.9 billion per annum, which is spent on the NHS, police, criminal justice system, and welfare system. This is where the importance of taking tradition seriously must be stressed. We should not be rejecting tradition because it is considered restrictive, without asking questions about what harm those restrictions are preventing. Additionally, we certainly should not be rejecting it simply by virtue of it being a tradition. The fact that something is old is not enough to deduce that it is foolish. And the fact that something is meant to restrict you from a particular kind of behavior is not enough to call it oppressive. When I tell my daughter not to put forks in the plug socket, I am not acting like an unruly dictator, making arbitrary decisions absent of any wisdom. On the contrary, I care for her well-being and wish to facilitate an environment that is conducive to her flourishing, regardless of whether she can understand my reasoning or not. Another common objection against tradition is the notion that we should be allowed to learn from our own mistakes. However, this should not be put forward without regard for when such a notion might be suitable and when not. It might very well be fair enough to say this when your child is going through a process of trial and error while learning how to play chess or building a small robot, but it certainly would not be a praiseworthy approach if they are thinking of trying heroin or drinking bleach. I think many would agree that in such circumstances, it is perfectly reasonable for the older and wiser to step in and prevent them from making a mistake, especially when the lessons may cause lasting harm or even death. It is better to demand that the individual in question looks at the experiences of others and learns from their mistakes, rather than having to make their own, or simply to trust those who have more life experience and who care for them. Yes, it is true that going through the process of making that mistake might give you a deeper insight into the wisdom behind the need for a restriction, but it certainly is not necessary. Also, there is not much insight to be had if something kills you or harms you in a significant way. The wise can learn from the mistakes of others and do not need to make the mistakes themselves. Learning from others also saves time and allows it to be spent on more productive endeavors. This is what is expressed when we say that we are standing on the shoulders of giants. We do not need to go through the difficulties our predecessors did. Magnus Carlsen, a Norwegian chess world champion, was able to surpass many of his competitors from a very early age because he had the ability to get a head start on consuming the techniques of the other grandmasters and not have to make the same mistakes they did to get to their level. He could just review their greatest games, take what was good, and leave what wasn't. Tradition can conceivably be the wisdom of the old and a call from the people of ages gone by, advising us to avoid certain types of behavior, in the same way that I may command my daughter not to put a fork in the plug socket. Tradition can be the process of learning from the mistakes of others who have more wisdom, gained by a collection of experiences. Tradition could also conceivably be handed down from a higher power with the wisdom, knowledge, and ability to give us guidance, so that we do not have to make the mistakes others have made or will make. This could be to protect us from harm, or to simply give us a competitive edge against other people or systems of thought. We must stand in the possibility that there may very well be something to learn from the stories we are given, but this involves a mindful exploration, not a mindless rejection. I want you, the reader, to begin an exploration into Islam. Be open to the possibility of the wisdom available within its teachings. More on leaps of faith. Earlier in the book, we discussed how life is short and time passes quickly. Unfortunately, we do not have the ability to stop time from barreling forward and to ponder on the problems of life until we feel we have pondered on them enough. Unlike the typical thought experiments given in philosophy seminars, where we are given a particular example of a problem and have hours to discuss this with classmates, lecturers, and friends, this luxury is not always provided in the real world. Sometimes a dilemma arises, and it demands a response from you now. A child may be drowning, but you do not have the time to consider whether the child may grow to be the next Adolf Hitler. Nor do you have the time to consider whether your action is good because of its consequences, or because of the intention, or whether something is good by its nature, or because it was commanded, etc. Sometimes you just have to act. Time keeps moving forward, and for the theist and the atheist, it demands the occasional leap of faith. We are ignorant beings who lack a complete picture. We do not ever have all the information at hand in any given moment. Despite this, however, we must still make choices. We must still act. Even refusing to act in a positive sense, that is, to do something, is to act in a negative sense, to do nothing. One of the definitions of faith is to have great trust or confidence in something or someone. It can also mean to have belief that is not based on proof or held without question. Many of the actions we take daily are based on leaps of faith. We often have trust or confidence in both the things we do and the people we depend on throughout society, whether proof is available or not. Seldom do we question it. We do not have food testers making sure our food is not poisoned. We do not check every banknote and coin we are given to make sure they are legitimate. We believe that the sun will rise tomorrow. We continue to make plans as though we will continue to exist. We pick jobs and career paths that we do not yet have any experience in. We trust the drivers on the road will not swerve and crash into us while we walk along the pavement. We commit to long-term relationships and start families, despite having no vision of how the future will turn out. The list goes on. More importantly, however, and we mentioned this briefly in the section above on empirical evidence, is the confidence, trust, and faith people have in the scientific community, as well as the relationship the scientific community has with the public and among themselves. Every individual must specialize in something, and the consequence of this specialization is to have hyperfocus in a single slice of one or maybe several fields out of many. Take the physicist, for example. He must first pick a subject to focus on. In this case, that would be physics. Once he has picked his subject, he will then further specialize as his studies in this field progress. He must focus on something specific, like quantum mechanics or astrophysics, which he will then further specialize in again. Each branch of science leads to more branches, like a tree. Each branch has an abundance of information that anyone who specializes in it needs to absorb to grasp the field and become competent in it. As an individual, he must focus on what is at hand, and maybe read summaries or brief explanations of connecting or parallel fields. Everyone will have a greater grasp of their own chosen fields, and must have trust and confidence in the community they are embedded within at large. That is, they do not have the time or the ability to check that everyone is doing as they should be, and not making mistakes or being negligent. Nor do they have time to check for corruption and wrongdoing. This is the case for every individual in the larger community. If you were to draw this out in a diagram, and from every individual you draw a line in blue to show what they have knowledge in, and what evidence they have observed, and a red line for everything they have trust or confidence in without being shown the evidence, then you would see that the diagram would have a lot more red lines in it than blue, as a consequence of this specialization. Now, if you then continue to overlay the maps of all people involved in this complex and intricate network of learning and knowledge, you will come to see that the red lines, indicating faith, would come to dominate the diagram to the point where very little blue would be seen at all, if any. This isn't to say the things they have faith in have no validity or basis for them. It is simply to point out that faith exists in these communities, despite what the naysayers may insist. The major issue here is that no one can oversee this entire operation, as it is too large and complex. No one has the entire thing grasped. We believe in it pragmatically because what we are doing seems to produce results. Faith is an intricate part of society. The modern machine has become so complex and so intricate that it seems to be completely inevitable and necessary. My aim with this section is to put forward the proposition that it makes no sense to ridicule faith. This is especially so considering that it is an integral part of human life and a necessary consequence of our finitude, alongside the sheer quantity of things there are to possibly know. The concept of faith has become a dirty word. This is exemplified by the popularization of faith versus reason or religion versus science debates, as though they are inherently dichotomous. The reality is that the discussion on faith is much more nuanced than this. Faith can be guided by reason, and reason can lead to points where a leap of faith is necessary for further progress to take place. A great example of this can be found with the problem of the external world. During the early Enlightenment period in the 16th and 17th centuries, there was a growing revival of skepticism. There are several possible reasons for this. There was the Protestant Reformation in 1517, the expansion of empires abroad leading to the discovery of many new cultures, and the translations of ancient Greek writers on skepticism, like that of Sextus Empiricus, published by Henricus Stephanus. This all appears to have possibly fueled the popularization of skepticism enough to motivate the French philosopher René Descartes to want to combat it. On this, Harry Bracken says, "Contemporaries may have found skeptical arguments a source of fun and intellectual pleasure, but Descartes was never amused. He saw skepticism as a menace which could not be constrained within the limits of the theological/religious debate. With the rise of skepticism, dogmatically held beliefs were beginning to be questioned, and one by one, things people had taken for granted were beginning to be discussed. One of the subjects that began to be discussed was the very existence of the external world. Most people go about their daily business and act as though it is beyond doubt that the world outside of them exists. It rarely goes questioned, and it is not likely that many people have tried to come up with sound deductive arguments, which prove necessarily that the external world does in fact exist, and is not the figment of someone's imagination or an illusion created by Descartes' hypothetical evil demon. It turns out that coming up with a perfectly sound deductive argument for the external world is quite difficult. You can see this difficulty being expressed through the development of ideas that began with Descartes and continue through other philosophers like John Locke, George Berkeley, and Immanuel Kant. Long story short, this back and forth between the above characters eventually leads to Kant talking of the distinction between phenomena and noumena. Phenomena are objects of our experience as presented to us by the mind, and noumena are the things in themselves, which are distinct from our experiences and ultimately unknowable. What he means to show by this is that we, as conscious beings, have access only to our experiences. Ultimately, we can never know anything about the things which give rise to our experiences. That is, we are stuck peering through the veil of our perceptions, and the external world is beyond our epistemic horizon and out of our reach. Our minds receive information, but they always filter it through a cognitive process before the experience is presented to us as a phenomenon. We never get pure, unadulterated information. The brain is always processing it first, before it presents it to us. The reason I mention this development is because it flies in the face of the notion that everything requires an argument to be believed. I would posit, as I think most people would, that it is perfectly reasonable to go about the world and to continue living as though the external world does exist, despite not having an argument in justification of this belief. I would go further than this and argue that it is completely unreasonable to expect everyone to have an in-depth argument on such things. Furthermore, the scientific community moves forward with this same assumption. They do not give explicit justification for the existence of an external world that is intelligible, nor do they need to. Science just works, and the approach with regard to many of the fundamental questions here ends up being a pragmatic one. We get results from it, and we reap the benefits. There is no need to waste time questioning our assumptions about this. Finally, the kind of faith I am arguing in defense of here is not blind faith, but rather guided faith. There are still reasons people may take a leap in one direction rather than another, but this does not negate the fact that they are still leaps. I am not making a blanket accusation against the scientific community that they all make exclusively blind leaps of faith, nor am I saying that there are no cases of theists making blind leaps as well. All I am trying to get you to do is leave behind these childish notions that it's only silly religious people that have faith, and that it's something we can avoid. Admit you have it, analyze yourself and your beliefs, and try to determine where your faith lies by being open and honest about it. You own it. Only then can this discussion move forward productively. I hope that I have shown that the dialogue surrounding the concept of faith is a nuanced one, and I hope I have convinced you not to fall into these oversimplified binaries. I will now ask you to make a leap of faith with me, not into belief, but into action. On finding balance. Hopefully so far, we have paved a way towards helping people be more open to the ideas that are going to be coming up. The next step I would like to take is to offer a suggestion for a certain way of being, and a brief explanation as to why this is important. First and foremost, I want to make something clear. I will not be asking the reader to take a blind leap of faith into religion. However, I will discuss the possibility of taking a leap of faith with regards to certain practices. The reason I will be asking you to practice these things is that I believe there is a potential that it will open you up further to the possibility of theism, and more specifically, to Islam. I want to suggest to you to avoid doing certain things that I believe can cause great harm, and offer nothing but mind fog and distractions to someone who is seeking truth. There are many things prohibited by the Quran and Sunnah, but I wish to focus on some things over others, namely, the prohibition of alcohol, drugs, gambling, foul language, and sexual immorality. The problems that societies face because of these things are likely to be more obvious to some than others. However, I do not wish to give you a long tangent on why they are bad or how exactly they affect society, as it is beyond the scope of this book. For the time being, I wish to put this forward as a personally recommended first step for a consciously made leap of faith. I hope that you will see the benefits these decisions will give you, and that you experience the wisdom behind their restrictions firsthand. The main line of reasoning I will give to motivate you is that these things can consume your time and money, be addictive, and can be mentally and/or physically damaging. If you are engaging in any of them, stop. God willing, you will begin to see the benefits of leaving them behind. I will give an analogy to help you understand what it is I am attempting to do with this suggestion. Imagine you wake up in an underwater cave with scuba gear on, and just enough air to get out and to the surface. The water is murky and filled with dirt and mud. You think the best course of action is to do something, and so you kick and punch your way around trying to move the dust out of the way and get some clarity. The more you try to do, the worse your vision becomes, and the more dirt you kick up into the water. However, if you were to stop moving around and stayed patient for a moment, you would see that the dust would begin to settle, and the water would become a little clearer with each passing moment. If you waited long enough, the water would become clear enough for you to see through. You could begin to explore the area and find a way out. With this leap of faith, I am simply asking you to stop kicking up mud. Time is of the essence. If you can take this leap with me, you'll save yourself a lot of problems. So please, stop using intoxicants, stop gambling, stop talking in foul ways, and stop engaging in sexual immorality. Let the water settle, and let your mind become clear from distractions. Abu Hurairah reported, "The Messenger of Allah, peace and blessings be upon him, said, 'Verily, when the servant commits a sin, a black mark appears upon his heart. If he abandons the sin, seeks forgiveness, and repents, then his heart will be polished. If he returns to the sin, the blackness will be increased until it overcomes his heart. It is the covering that Allah has mentioned. No, rather a covering is over their hearts from what they have earned.'" Chapter 83, verse 14. As the hadith suggests, the bad habits that you are engaging in can be an impediment to your vision. When we engage in addictive behavior, we can become so focused on the objects of our desires that it becomes difficult to see or focus on other things. Make a pledge to give them up and allow the benefits of this to manifest themselves to you. This is not a necessary step, as I am sure people can and do still find guidance despite engaging in forbidden acts regularly. It is also the case that when the heart and mind settle on belief in Islam, that a heavy sense of duty can overcome the believer, motivating them to give up the bad being a common consequence of this. In any case, there is certainly wisdom in following such prohibitions, and taking up the opportunity to gain an insight through direct experience of its benefits. I think this will be something that could potentially help you incline towards the right direction. If you are patient and stick with it through the initial difficulty of leaving behind addictive behavior, I am sure this wisdom could become apparent, removing yet another obstacle between you and belief in Islam. Another thing I would recommend is prostrating to your Creator and asking Him for guidance. If you are open to the idea, a moment of sincere openness while pleading with Him to guide you to the truth can have a profound effect. I know many people who have embraced Islam who can pinpoint having done this at some point in their journey, including myself. Being open to the possibility of his existence and attempting to develop a relationship with him is a way in which you can draw closer to him and his religion.